My name is Sarah Chen, and I never expected that cleaning out my great-aunt's dusty Portland home would change my life forever. When Aunt Margaret passed away last month, she left behind a Victorian house in the Hawthorne district that nobody in the family wanted to deal with. The place had been sitting empty for years, filled with decades of accumulated memories and what most people would call junk. Margaret had always been the family mystery. While my parents built their successful restaurant business and my cousins pursued conventional careers in medicine and law, Margaret had lived her life on the margins, unmarried, childless, and seemingly content to spend her days surrounded by what the rest of us considered clutter. Family gatherings were always awkward when Margaret attended, which wasn't often. She would sit quietly in the corner, observing everything with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than she let on. I was the only one willing to take on the task of sorting through everything. Maybe it was because I was between jobs after my marketing position was eliminated in corporate restructuring, or maybe it was because I'd always felt a strange connection to Aunt Margaret, even though we rarely spoke. When I was a child, she would slip me books about local history and old photographs of Portland from decades past. She was the family eccentric, the one who never married, never had children, and spent her life collecting what others called worthless trinkets. The family meeting about Margaret's estate had been uncomfortable. My parents, uncle, and cousins sat around the dining room table, discussing her property like it was a burden to be disposed of as quickly as possible. "The house needs too much work," my uncle had said. "And all that junk she collected, it'll cost more to haul away than any of it's worth." I had surprised everyone, including myself, by volunteering to handle the cleanup. "I have time," I had said, "and maybe some of her things have value. Let me go through everything before we decide what to do." The October rain was drumming against the windows as I stood in her cluttered living room, surrounded by boxes of old photographs, vintage jewelry, and stacks of books that smelled like time itself. The house creaked and groaned around me, its old bones settling in the dampness that defines Portland autumns. The wallpaper was faded and peeling in places, and the hardwood floors showed the wear of nearly a century of footsteps. I'd been working for 3 days straight, methodically going through each room. The dining room was filled with china sets that hadn't been used in decades, each piece carefully wrapped in tissue paper and stored in original boxes. The kitchen drawers were stuffed with recipe cards written in Margaret's careful handwriting, recipes for dishes I'd never heard of, some with notes like Mrs. Wong's dumplings or Rosa's tamales that suggested Margaret had friends from many different communities. The bedrooms upstairs held closets full of clothes from every decade since the 1960s. Not just Margaret's clothing, but garments that seemed to represent different eras and cultures. There were traditional Chinese dresses, Mexican embroidered blouses, and even what looked like Native American ceremonial items that made me wonder about Margaret's connections to communities I'd never known she was part of. Each discovery raised more questions about who Margaret really was. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, I found prescriptions filled at pharmacies all over the city, suggesting she traveled far from her neighborhood for basic errands. In the bedroom, I discovered books written in Chinese, Spanish, and what looked like Russian, languages I had no idea she could read. It was in the study, her personal sanctuary, that I found the envelope that would change everything. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, every inch packed with volumes on subjects ranging from local history to antique collecting. But looking more closely, I realized the collection was much more sophisticated than I'd initially thought. There were academic journals, rare historical texts, and reference books that suggested serious research rather than casual interest. Margaret's old oak desk sat in the corner, covered with papers and correspondence. I was sorting through the desk drawers when I found it, a large cream-colored envelope tucked behind a stack of old bank statements. The envelope felt significant somehow, different from the other papers scattered throughout the desk. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. The envelope was addressed to Margaret in faded blue ink, with a return address I didn't recognize from somewhere in Seattle. The postmark was from 1987, over 30 years ago. What caught my attention was how carefully it had been preserved, as if it held something precious. While other papers showed the effects of time and handling, this envelope was pristine, protected somehow from the wear that had affected everything else. I opened it gently, expecting to find a letter or important document. Instead, the envelope appeared to be completely empty. I turned it upside down, shook it gently, even held it up to the light streaming through the rain-streaked window. Nothing fell out. No papers rustled inside. I was about to toss it into the discard pile when something made me pause. The envelope felt heavier than it should have for being empty. It was a subtle difference, but noticeable when I held it in my hands. I ran my fingers along the inside, feeling for anything that might be stuck in the corners or hidden in creases. That's when I noticed it. A slight irregularity in the bottom of the envelope. The bottom wasn't quite flat. There was a barely perceptible difference in thickness, as if there were 2 layers instead of 1. My heart began to race as I realized what I might be looking at: a false bottom. Someone had carefully constructed a hidden compartment within what appeared to be an ordinary envelope. I carefully worked my fingernail along the edge, trying not to damage whatever was hidden inside. The adhesive was old, but still holding, and it took several minutes of patient work before the bottom layer began to peel away. Hidden beneath was a small compartment, no bigger than a matchbox, and inside that compartment was something that made my breath catch in my throat: a key. An old brass key, ornate and heavy, with an intricate design I'd never seen before. The metal was tarnished with age, but still beautiful, with scrollwork and patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. This wasn't just any key. It was the kind of key that opened something important, something valuable enough to warrant such elaborate concealment. But more importantly, attached to the key with a small piece of thread was a folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded it to reveal an address written in Margaret's careful handwriting: 1247 Burnside Street, Unit 47. I'd lived in Portland my entire life, and I knew Burnside Street well. It was one of the main arteries running through the city, lined with everything from trendy restaurants to old warehouse buildings that had been converted into artists' studios and small businesses. But I couldn't immediately place what might be at that specific address, or why Margaret would have hidden a key to it so carefully. My hands were shaking as I held the key up to the light. It was beautiful, with scrollwork and patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. This wasn't just any key. It was the kind of key that opens something important. The weight of it in my palm felt significant, and I could see that it had been worn smooth in places, suggesting it had been used regularly over many years. I grabbed my phone and quickly searched for the address. The results showed a building that had been converted into storage units sometime in the 1980s. A storage facility. Aunt Margaret had a storage unit that none of us knew about, and she had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the key to it. The implications hit me like a wave. What had she been hiding? Why had she gone to such lengths to conceal the key? And what was waiting for me at 1247 Burnside Street? The timing of the envelope's postmark suggested she had established this storage unit over 30 years ago, meaning whatever was there had been hidden for most of my lifetime. I looked around the study, seeing it with new eyes. All these years, I'd thought I knew Margaret, the quiet, eccentric aunt who lived alone with her books and her collections. But this key suggested there was so much more to her story. The sophisticated books, the international correspondence, the careful preservation of this hidden key. It all pointed to a life that was far more complex and purposeful than any of us had realized. The rain continued to fall outside, and the house felt even more mysterious now. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every corner might be hiding another clue. I realized that what I'd thought was a simple estate cleanup had just become something much more significant. Margaret hadn't just been a collector, she had been a person with secrets important enough to hide, and for some reason, she had chosen to leave me the key to discovering them. I slipped the key into my pocket, feeling its weight against my leg. Tomorrow, I would drive to Burnside Street and see what Aunt Margaret had been keeping from all of us. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. As I locked up the house and walked to my car, the key seemed to burn with possibility in my pocket. Margaret had trusted me with this secret, even if she'd never told me directly. Whatever was waiting in that storage unit, I was meant to find it. The question was I ready for what I might discover? The drive home through Portland's rain-slicked streets felt different somehow. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement like scattered diamonds, and I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets might be hidden in the buildings I passed. How many other people had storage units filled with mysteries? How many other families had stories they'd never told? Back in my small apartment in the Pearl District, I sat at my kitchen table with the key in front of me. I turned it over in my hands, studying every detail. The craftsmanship was exquisite. This wasn't a mass-produced key from a hardware store. Someone had taken great care in making it, which meant whatever it opened was important enough to warrant such attention. I spent the evening researching the address, trying to find any connection to Margaret or our family. The building had been constructed in the 1920s as a warehouse for one of Portland's import companies, then converted to storage units in the 1980s during the city's industrial decline. The timing matched the postmark on the envelope perfectly, suggesting Margaret had rented the unit right around the time of the conversion. I tried to remember what had been happening in Margaret's life in 1987. I would have been just a few years old then, too young to pay attention to adult activities. But I vaguely recalled family conversations about Margaret taking some kind of extended trip that year, though no one had ever said where she went or why. That night, I dreamed of locked doors and hidden passages, of secrets waiting to be discovered. I woke up several times, my heart pounding, feeling as if Margaret was trying to tell me something from beyond the grave. Each time, I reached for the key on my nightstand, reassuring myself that it was real, that tomorrow's adventure wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The weight of the key in my hand felt like a promise, a connection to a part of Margaret's life that none of us had ever known existed. By morning, I had made my decision. I would go to the storage facility as soon as it opened. Whatever Margaret had hidden there, it was time for it to see the light of day. The Burnside storage facility looked exactly like what you'd expect from a converted 1920s warehouse. Red brick walls stained with decades of Portland rain, small windows set high in the walls, and a utilitarian design that spoke of function over form. I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, just as the facility opened, my palms sweating despite the cool October morning. The building sat on a corner lot where Burnside intersected with a smaller street, surrounded by a mix of newer apartment buildings and older industrial structures that told the story of Portland's changing economy. The neighborhood had been transitioning for years, with coffee shops and restaurants gradually replacing auto repair shops and warehouses. The manager, a middle-aged man named Bob with graying hair and kind eyes, greeted me at the front desk. His office was small and cramped, filled with filing cabinets and a coffee maker that had seen better days. The smell of old paper and industrial cleaning supplies filled the air. On his desk were photographs of what I assumed were his grandchildren, and a coffee mug that read, "World's okayest storage manager." "I'm looking for information about Unit 47, I said, showing him the key. "I believe it belonged to my great-aunt, Margaret Chen." Bob's eyes lit up with recognition, and his entire demeanor changed. "Margaret? I haven't seen her in months. I was starting to worry about her. Used to come by once a month, regular as clockwork. Always paid her rent on time, never any trouble." His expression grew serious as he took in my past tense reference. "I'm sorry for your loss. She was a good tenant. One of the best we've ever had, actually." He pulled out a thick ledger and flipped through pages yellowed with age. The ledger was clearly a relic from the pre-computer era, filled with handwritten entries in various pens and pencils. "Let's see. Unit 47. Yes, here it is. Margaret Chen. Rented since October 1987. Paid up through the end of next year. She always paid in advance, that one. Sometimes paid for 2 or 3 years at a time." He looked up at me with curiosity. "Do you have documentation showing you're authorized to access the unit?" I showed him Margaret's will and death certificate, along with the legal documents establishing me as the executor of her estate. Bob nodded approvingly and made copies for his files, handling the paperwork with the care of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. "Margaret was one of our longest tenants," Bob continued as he prepared the paperwork. "Been coming here for over 30 years. Always very polite, very private. Never caused any problems. Never needed anything except basic maintenance when the lock got sticky one winter." He paused, seeming to remember something. "She always brought me cookies at Christmas, homemade ones. My wife and I looked forward to them every year." This detail surprised me. I'd never known Margaret to bake, and the image of her carefully preparing Christmas cookies for a storage facility manager revealed yet another facet of her personality that our family had never seen. "Unit 47 is on the 3rd floor, Bob said, handing me a small flashlight. "Some of the lights up there are a bit dim. Take the elevator. The stairs can be tricky if you're not familiar with the building. And take your time. Margaret always spent at least an hour up there whenever she visited. The elevator was one of those old freight elevators with a metal gate that you had to pull closed manually. The car itself was spacious enough to move furniture, with worn wooden floors and walls painted industrial gray. It creaked and groaned as it carried me up to the third floor, and I couldn't help but think about how many times Margaret had made this same journey over the past 35 years. The third floor was a maze of narrow corridors lined with storage unit doors. Each door was painted industrial green and marked with a black number. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and some flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The air smelled like dust and old cardboard, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of decades of stored memories. The corridors were wide enough for handcarts and dollies, and I could see the wheel marks on the concrete floor where countless tenants had moved their belongings in and out over the years. Some of the unit doors had additional padlocks or security stickers, suggesting that people stored valuable items here. I found Unit 47 at the end of a corridor, tucked away in a corner where the building's original architecture created an odd angle. The door was slightly smaller than the others, and I noticed that it had been fitted with additional security measures, extra locks and reinforced hinges that weren't standard for the facility. Someone had taken particular care to ensure this unit was secure. My heart was pounding as I inserted the ornate key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The mechanisms clicked with a satisfying precision that spoke of quality construction. The door swung open with a soft creak, and I stepped inside. The unit was about the size of a walk-in closet, but it was packed with carefully organized items. Unlike the chaotic mess of Margaret's house, everything here was methodically arranged and labeled. Wooden crates lined the walls, each marked with dates and brief descriptions in Margaret's neat handwriting. The organization was impressive. This wasn't the random storage of unwanted belongings, but the careful archiving of important materials. In the center of the unit stood a small desk with a chair, and on the desk was a thick leather journal. The desk was clearly vintage, with dovetailed drawers and brass hardware that matched the key I'd used to open the unit. A small desk lamp provided illumination, and I noticed that the unit had been wired for electricity, another unusual feature that suggested Margaret had spent significant time here. I picked up the journal with trembling hands and opened to the first page. Margaret's handwriting filled the page, and the date at the top was from October 1987, the same month and year as the envelope's postmark. "If you're reading this," the first entry began, "then you found the key, and I'm no longer here to explain in person. I hope it's you, Sarah. I always felt you were the one who would understand." I sank into the chair, my legs suddenly weak. She had known. Somehow, she had known I would be the one to find the key and follow the trail she'd left. The implications of this foresight were staggering. Margaret had been planning for this moment for over 30 years. The journal continued. "What you'll find in this unit represents 40 years of my life's work. I was never just a collector of antiques and curiosities, as the family always believed. I was a historian, a detective, and a guardian of stories that others wanted to forget." I looked around the unit with new eyes. The wooden crates weren't just storage, they were archives. Each one was carefully labeled with locations, dates, and brief descriptions. Chinatown Fire, 1886. Vanport Flood, 1948. Urban Renewal, 1960s. Timberworkers Strike, 1972. Vietnamese Refugees, 1975, 1980. The scope of the collection was breathtaking. Margaret had been documenting Portland's history, but not the sanitized version that appeared in official records. These were the stories of ordinary people, marginalized communities, and events that had been downplayed or forgotten by mainstream historical accounts. I opened the crate marked Chinatown Fire and found it filled with photographs, documents, and artifacts from Portland's historic Chinese district. There were pictures of buildings that no longer existed, letters written in Chinese characters with English translations attached in Margaret's handwriting, and even small objects like buttons and coins that had been recovered from the ruins. But these weren't just random artifacts. Each item was carefully cataloged with information about its provenance, significance, and the story it told. Margaret had created detailed index cards for every photograph, explaining who was in the picture, when and where it was taken, and how she had acquired it. The level of scholarly rigor was impressive. The crate labeled Vanport Flood contained similar treasures, photographs of the temporary city that had housed shipyard workers during World War II, personal items from families who had lost everything when the Columbia River levee broke, and documents detailing the aftermath that had been largely ignored by official histories. What struck me most was the human focus of Margaret's collection. While official histories talked about policy decisions and economic impacts, Margaret had collected the stories of individuals and families. She had photographs of children playing in Vanport streets, letters from workers to their families back home, and even ration cards and other everyday items that showed how people actually lived. As I moved from crate to crate, I realized that Margaret had been documenting the stories of Portland's marginalized communities, the people whose experiences had been overlooked or deliberately erased from official records. She had been collecting not just objects, but testimonies, photographs, and documents that told the real story of the city's development. The journal explained her mission in greater detail. History is written by the victors, but the real story lives in the experiences of ordinary people. I've spent my life collecting these stories, preserving them for future generations who might want to understand what really happened. I found correspondence with elderly immigrants who had shared their stories with Margaret, letters from urban renewal survivors who had trusted her with their memories, and receipts for countless hours spent in archives and libraries, piecing together the fragments of forgotten histories. The breadth of her network was astonishing. She had built relationships with people across the city, earning their trust and documenting their experiences. One section of the journal detailed her methodology. The key is to listen without judgment and to understand that every person's experience is valid. Official records often contradict lived experiences, and when that happens, I believe the people who were actually there. But it was the final crate that took my breath away. It was labeled simply The Portland Chinese Massacre, 1886, New Evidence. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, including what appeared to be a handwritten confession from someone involved in the violent expulsion of Chinese residents from the city. The confession was written on aged paper in careful handwriting, dated 1923, and signed by a man named Thomas Willard. The document began, "I am dying, and I can no longer live with the weight of what I helped do in 1886. The truth must be told, even if it destroys reputations that have been built on lies." According to Willard's account, the violence hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned and organized by a secret committee of prominent businessmen who wanted to drive out their Chinese competitors. The document included names, dates, and locations that had never appeared in any official record. If this was authentic, it would completely rewrite the historical understanding of one of Portland's darkest chapters. The confession detailed meetings held in private clubs, payments made to agitators, and coordination with sympathetic police officers who ensured that the violence would go unpunished. It described the careful planning that went into what had been portrayed in official accounts as a spontaneous outburst of public sentiment. I spent the next 3 hours going through the unit, each discovery more astonishing than the last. Margaret had been operating as a one-woman historical society, collecting and preserving stories that mainstream institutions had ignored. She had conducted interviews with survivors, tracked down descendants of witnesses, and even acquired documents that had been deliberately hidden from public view. The scope of her work was breathtaking. She had documented everything from the experiences of Japanese American families during World War II internment to the stories of African American railroad workers who had built the city's infrastructure. Each collection was meticulously organized and cross-referenced, creating a comprehensive alternative history of Portland that revealed the human cost of progress. One particularly moving collection focused on the Vanport community. Margaret had gathered oral histories from survivors, photographs of daily life in the temporary city, and documents showing how the flood's aftermath had been used to justify urban planning decisions that displaced communities of color. The personal stories brought the larger historical forces into sharp focus. As I sat in that small storage unit, surrounded by the life's work of a woman I thought I barely knew, I felt a profound sense of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Margaret had trusted me with this treasure trove of forgotten stories, and I was beginning to understand why. The journal's final entry was dated just 2 months before her death. "I'm getting old, and I worry about what will happen to all of this when I'm gone. The institutions aren't interested. They say it's too controversial, too political. But these stories need to be told. If something happens to me, I hope whoever finds this will understand the importance of preserving these voices. I closed the journal and looked around the unit one more time. This wasn't just a collection of historical artifacts. It was a calling. Margaret had spent her life giving voice to the voiceless, and now she was passing that responsibility to me. The weight of the discovery was overwhelming. What was I supposed to do with all of this? How could I honor Margaret's work while also protecting the sensitive nature of some of the materials? And what about the confession regarding the Chinese massacre? Did I have an obligation to share that with historians and the public? As I locked up the unit and headed back to the elevator, my mind was racing with possibilities and questions. I had come here expecting to find some family mementos or perhaps a few valuable antiques. Instead, I had discovered that my great-aunt had been a secret guardian of Portland's hidden history, and now that guardianship had fallen to me. Bob was waiting for me at the front desk, his eyes full of curiosity. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. How could I explain what I'd found? How could I tell him that his quiet, punctual tenant had been conducting groundbreaking historical research in Unit 47? "She was quite a lady, your aunt," Bob said softly. "Always knew there was more to her story than met the eye. She had this way of asking questions about the neighborhood, about the people who used to live here. Made me think about things I'd never considered before." As I walked back to my car, the October sky had cleared, and weak sunlight was filtering through the clouds. The city looked different now. Every building potentially held stories. Every street corner might be the site of forgotten history. Margaret had opened my eyes to the layers of experience that exist beneath the surface of everyday life. I had a choice to make. I could treat this discovery as a family curiosity, donate the materials to a museum, and return to my job search. Or I could take up Margaret's mission and continue the work she had started. As I drove home through the streets of Portland, I realized there was really no choice at all. The stories were calling to me, just as they had called to Margaret. The voices of the past were waiting to be heard, and I was being offered the chance to be their messenger. But first, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The confession about the Chinese massacre was potentially explosive, and I would need expert help to verify its authenticity and understand its implications. Margaret had trusted me with these stories, but now I needed to find others who could help me honor that trust responsibly. Margaret had made this same journey over the past 35 years. The third floor was a maze of narrow corridors lined with storage unit doors. Each door was painted industrial green and marked with a black number. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and some flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. I found Unit 47 at the end of a corridor, tucked away in a corner where the building's original architecture created an odd angle. The door was slightly smaller than the others, and I noticed that it had been fitted with additional security measures, extra locks, and reinforced hinges that weren't standard for the facility. My heart was pounding as I inserted the ornate key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The door swung open with a soft creak, and I stepped inside. The unit was about the size of a walk-in closet, but it was packed with carefully organized items. Unlike the chaotic mess of Margaret's house, everything here was methodically arranged and labeled. Wooden crates lined the walls, each marked with dates and brief descriptions in Margaret's neat handwriting. In the center of the unit stood a small desk with a chair, and on the desk was a thick leather journal. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened to the first page. Margaret's handwriting filled the page, and the date at the top was from 1987, the same year the envelope had been postmarked. "If you're reading this," the first entry began, "then you found the key, and I'm no longer here to explain in person. I hope it's you, Sarah. I always felt you were the one who would understand." I sank into the chair, my legs suddenly weak. She had known. Somehow she had known I would be the one to find the key and follow the trail she'd left. The journal continued. "What you'll find in this unit represents 40 years of my life's work. I was never just a collector of antiques and curiosities, as the family always believed. I was a historian, a detective, and a guardian of stories that others wanted to forget." I looked around the unit with new eyes. The wooden crates weren't just storage, they were archives. Each one was carefully labeled with locations, dates, and brief descriptions. Chinatown Fire, 1886, Vanport Flood, 1948, Urban Renewal, 1960s. I opened the crate marked Chinatown Fire, and found it filled with photographs, documents, and artifacts from Portland's historic Chinese district. There were pictures of buildings that no longer existed, letters written in Chinese characters, and even small objects like buttons and coins that had been recovered from the ruins. The crate labeled Vanport Flood contained similar treasures, photographs of the temporary city that had housed shipyard workers during World War II, personal items from families who had lost everything when the Columbia River levee broke, and documents detailing the aftermath that had been largely ignored by official histories. As I moved from crate to crate, I realized that Margaret had been documenting the stories of Portland's marginalized communities, the people whose experiences had been overlooked or deliberately erased from official records. She had been collecting not just objects, but testimonies, photographs, and documents that told the real story of the city's development. The journal explained her mission. History is written by the victors, but the real story lives in the experiences of ordinary people. I've spent my life collecting these stories, preserving them for future generations who might want to understand what really happened. I found correspondence with elderly immigrants who had shared their stories with Margaret, letters from urban renewal survivors who had trusted her with their memories, and receipts for countless hours spent in archives and libraries, piecing together the fragments of forgotten histories. But it was the final crate that took my breath away. It was labeled simply, "The Portland Chinese Massacre, 1886, New Evidence." Inside were documents I'd never seen before, including what appeared to be a handwritten confession from someone involved in the violent expulsion of Chinese residents from the city. The confession was dated 1923 and written by a man named Thomas Willard, who claimed to be dying and wanted to set the record straight about what had really happened during those terrible days in 1886. According to his account, the violence hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned and organized by a secret committee of prominent businessmen who wanted to drive out their Chinese competitors. The document included names, dates, and locations that had never appeared in any official record. If this was authentic, it would completely rewrite the historical understanding of one of Portland's darkest chapters. I spent the next 3 hours going through the unit, each discovery more astonishing than the last. Margaret had been operating as a one-woman historical society, collecting and preserving stories that mainstream institutions had ignored. She had conducted interviews with survivors, tracked down descendants of witnesses, and even acquired documents that had been deliberately hidden from public view. The scope of her work was breathtaking. She had documented everything from the experiences of Japanese-American families during World War II internment to the stories of African-American railroad workers who had built the city's infrastructure. Each collection was meticulously organized and cross-referenced, creating a comprehensive alternative history of Portland that revealed the human cost of progress. As I sat in that small storage unit, surrounded by the life's work of a woman I thought I barely knew, I felt a profound sense of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Margaret had trusted me with this treasure trove of forgotten stories, and I was beginning to understand why. The journal's final entry was dated just 2 months before her death. "I'm getting old, and I worry about what will happen to all of this when I'm gone. The institutions aren't interested. They say it's too controversial, too political. But these stories need to be told. If something happens to me, I hope whoever finds this will understand the importance of preserving these voices." I closed the journal and looked around the unit one more time. This wasn't just a collection of historical artifacts. It was a calling. Margaret had spent her life giving voice to the voiceless, and now she was passing that responsibility to me. The weight of the discovery was overwhelming. What was I supposed to do with all of this? How could I honor Margaret's work while also protecting the sensitive nature of some of the materials? And what about the confession regarding the Chinese massacre? Did I have an obligation to share that with historians and the public? As I locked up the unit and headed back to the elevator, my mind was racing with possibilities and questions. I had come here expecting to find some family mementos or perhaps a few valuable antiques. Instead, I had discovered that my great-aunt had been a secret guardian of Portland's hidden history, and now that guardianship had fallen to me. The elevator ride down felt like a journey back to reality, but I knew that reality had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just Sarah Chen, unemployed and directionless. I was now the keeper of stories that could change how people understood their city and their past. Bob was waiting for me at the front desk, his eyes full of curiosity. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. How could I explain what I'd found? How could I tell him that his quiet, punctual tenant had been conducting groundbreaking historical research in Unit 47? "She was quite a lady, your aunt," Bob said softly. Always knew there was more to her story than met the eye. As I walked back to my car, the October sky had cleared and weak sunlight was filtering through the clouds. The city looked different now. Every building potentially held stories. Every street corner might be the site of forgotten history. Margaret had opened my eyes to the layers of experience that exist beneath the surface of everyday life. I had a choice to make. I could treat this discovery as a family curiosity, donate the materials to a museum, and return to my job search. Or I could take up Margaret's mission and continue the work she had started. As I drove home through the streets of Portland, I realized there was really no choice at all. The stories were calling to me just as they had called to Margaret. The voices of the past were waiting to be heard, and I was being offered the chance to be their messenger. The Confession of Thomas Willard haunted my dreams for days. I'd read it so many times that I had memorized entire passages, and each reading revealed new details that made the historical implications even more staggering. If this document was authentic, it would prove that the 1886 Chinese massacre wasn't a spontaneous act of mob violence, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving some of Portland's most respected citizens. The weight of what I discovered was beginning to affect every aspect of my life. I found myself unable to concentrate on mundane tasks, constantly thinking about the stories hidden in Margaret's collection. Every time I walked through downtown Portland, I imagined the events described in the confession playing out on these same streets over a century ago. I knew I needed expert help to verify the document's authenticity, but I also understood the sensitivity of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just history. It was a story that could impact families, reputations, and the way an entire city understood its past. Some of the names mentioned in Willard's confession were still prominent in Portland society, attached to buildings, streets, and charitable foundations. After days of research and internal debate, I decided to start with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of Pacific Northwest history at Portland State University. I'd found her name in Margaret's journal, mentioned as someone who had shown interest in alternative historical narratives. Margaret had noted that Dr. Rodriguez was one of the few academics willing to challenge conventional wisdom and had attended several of her public lectures over the years. Portland State University's campus stretched across several blocks in the heart of the city, a mix of modern buildings and converted warehouses that reflected the institution's urban mission. The history department was housed in one of the older buildings, with narrow hallways and small offices that created an atmosphere of scholarly intimacy. Dr. Rodriguez's office was tucked away in a corner of the history department, a small space overflowing with books, papers, and the accumulated detritus of decades of research. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and timelines that traced the development of the Pacific Northwest. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see through to the heart of things. "I remember Margaret," she said when I introduced myself, her face lighting up with recognition. "She came to several of my lectures over the years, especially the ones about marginalized communities and alternative historical narratives. Always asked thoughtful questions, always seemed to know more than she was letting on." She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. I was sorry to hear about her passing. She struck me as someone who really understood the importance of preserving forgotten stories. I had brought photocopies of some of Margaret's less sensitive materials, enough to give Dr. Rodriguez a sense of the scope of the collection without revealing the most explosive documents. Her eyes widened as she examined the photographs and documents, handling them with the care of someone who understood their potential significance. "This is extraordinary," she said, holding up a photograph of Chinatown from the 1880s that showed details I'd never seen in any published image. "I've been studying this period for 20 years, and I've never seen this photograph before. And these letters, they're in dialects that are rarely preserved in written form." She looked up at me with growing excitement. "Your aunt was doing serious historical work. This level of documentation and organization suggests real scholarly methodology." I nodded, then took a deep breath. "There's something else," I said, "something that could be very controversial. I showed her a photocopy of the Willard Confession, watching her face carefully as she read. Her expression grew increasingly serious, and by the time she finished, her hands were shaking slightly. She read it through twice, then sat back in her chair and stared at the document as if it might disappear. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her about the storage unit and Margaret's collection, emphasizing how carefully everything had been preserved and documented. I described the meticulous organization, the cross-referencing system Margaret had created, and the extensive correspondence that showed her careful verification of sources. Dr. How? Rodriguez listened intently, occasionally asking questions about the context in which the confession had been found. "If this is authentic," she said finally, "it's one of the most important historical documents related to Chinese American history that I've ever seen. But that's a very big if. We need to verify the handwriting, the paper, the ink, everything. The implications are too significant to take any chances." She explained that there were several tests that could be performed to establish the document's age and authenticity. The paper could be analyzed for chemical composition and aging patterns. The ink could be tested for consistency with materials available in 1923. And the handwriting could be compared to known samples of Thomas Willard's signature from other documents. "The problem," she continued, "is that this kind of analysis is expensive and time-consuming. And given the sensitive nature of the content, we need to be very careful about who we involve in the process. If word of this gets out before we can verify its authenticity, it could cause all sorts of problems." I understood her concerns. The confession implicated several founding families of Portland, people whose descendants still lived in the city and whose names were on buildings and streets throughout downtown. If the document was authentic, it would force a reckoning with the city's past that many people might not be ready for. Dr. Rodriguez made some phone calls and arranged for me to meet with other experts who could help evaluate the collection. She introduced me to Dr. Michael Chang, a professor specializing in Chinese American history whose own family had connections to Portland's early Chinese community. Dr. Chang's grandfather had been one of the few Chinese residents who had managed to return to Portland after the 1886 expulsion, and he had spent years researching his family's experience and the broader history of Chinese exclusion in the Pacific Northwest. "The official records are full of gaps and inconsistencies," Dr. Chang explained when we met in his office the following day. "There are witness accounts that contradict each other, police reports that seem incomplete, and newspaper coverage that's clearly biased. We've always suspected there was more to the story, some kind of coordination that wasn't documented in the public record." His office was smaller than Dr. Rodriguez's, but equally cluttered with research materials. The walls were covered with family photographs, including several that showed his grandfather and other Chinese immigrants in early Portland. There was also a large map of the city circa 1886, with the original Chinatown marked in red. When I showed him the confession, his reaction was even stronger than Dr. Rodriguez's had been. He read it twice, then sat back in his chair and ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to process the implications. "This fills in so many blanks," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "The names, the timeline, the coordination between different groups, it all makes sense now. My family has stories that were passed down orally, stories about warnings they received to leave the city, about seeing the same men multiple times in the days leading up to the violence. This document explains what they were witnessing." He pointed to specific passages in the confession that corroborated details his family had preserved in their oral history. "My great-grandmother always said the violence was too organized to be spontaneous, that the men who came to their building knew exactly what they were looking for. This confirms what she suspected, but could never prove." Dr. Chang's emotional response drove home the human significance of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was about real families, real trauma, and real consequences that had echoed through generations. We agreed to form a small research team to investigate the document's authenticity and explore its historical implications. In addition to Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Chang, we recruited Dr. Jennifer Williams, a document authentication expert from the University of Oregon who specialized in 19th and early 20th century papers and inks, and David Kim, a local historian who had been researching Portland's Asian American communities for decades and had extensive connections within those communities. The authentication process took 3 weeks and involved multiple types of analysis. Dr. Williams subjected the document to every test she could think of: paper analysis using microscopic examination and chemical testing, ink dating through spectroscopic analysis, and handwriting comparison using digital analysis tools. She also examined the document under various types of light to look for signs of forgery or alteration. Meanwhile, Dr. Chang and David Kim worked to verify the historical details mentioned in the confession, cross-referencing them with other sources and conducting interviews with descendants of the families involved. They spent hours in archives and libraries, tracking down business records, newspaper accounts, and other documents that might corroborate or contradict Willard's claims. The historical research proved particularly fascinating. The team discovered business records showing unusual coordination between companies owned by the men named in the confession, including joint meetings in the weeks leading up to the violence and shared financial arrangements that hadn't been previously documented. They found private letters in family archives that discussed the Chinese problem in terms that aligned with the confession's description of premeditated action. Most significantly, they uncovered photographs that corroborated some of the confession's most specific claims. One photograph, discovered in the Oregon Historical Society's archives, showed a group of men standing outside a building that Willard had identified as a meeting place. While the photograph had been cataloged as a routine business gathering, several of the men were identifiable as individuals named in the confession. The results of the authentication process were conclusive. The document was authentic. The paper and ink were consistent with materials available in 1923, showing the expected patterns of aging and chemical composition. The handwriting matched other examples of Thomas Willard's signature found in court documents and business records, displaying the same distinctive characteristics and pen pressure patterns. More importantly, the historical details aligned with previously unknown facts that the team had uncovered through their research. The confession's timeline matched business records. The described meeting locations could be verified through property records, and the names mentioned corresponded to individuals who had documented connections to each other and to the events of 1886. But with authentication came new challenges and responsibilities. What were we supposed to do with this information? How could we share it responsibly while honoring the victims of the original violence and respecting the complexity of the historical moment? The research team spent countless hours debating our obligations and the potential consequences of making the confession public. Some members of the team argued that the information should be shared immediately with the public, believing that historical truth should always take precedence over contemporary sensitivities. Others felt we needed to prepare the community for what could be a traumatic revelation, working with affected communities to ensure the story was told in a way that promoted healing rather than division. There were practical concerns as well. How might the story be sensationalized by the media? What would be the impact on descendants of both the perpetrators and the victims? How could we ensure that the confession was understood within its proper historical context rather than being used to score political points or settle contemporary grievances? I found myself thinking constantly about Margaret and what she would have wanted. Her journal made it clear that she believed in the importance of truth-telling, but she also understood the need for sensitivity and care in how difficult stories were shared. One entry that particularly resonated with me read, "The goal isn't to shame or blame, but to understand. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it and work to ensure that similar injustices don't happen again." As we wrestled with these questions, I continued to explore the rest of Margaret's collection, finding new connections and stories that added depth to our understanding of Portland's hidden history. Each crate revealed perspectives on familiar events that challenged conventional narratives and highlighted the experiences of people whose voices had been marginalized or silenced. The more I learned, the more I understood the scope of Margaret's vision and the personal cost of her work. She hadn't just been collecting historical artifacts, she had been creating a comprehensive alternative history of Portland that centered the experiences of its most vulnerable residents. But her journal also revealed years of frustration with institutions that weren't interested in her findings, rejection from publishers who found her work too controversial, and the isolation that came from knowing truths that others didn't want to hear. One evening, as I sat in the storage unit reading through Margaret's papers by the light of the small desk lamp, I found a letter she had written but never sent. It was addressed to me, dated just 6 months before her death, and it revealed the depth of her hopes and fears about the future of her work. "Dear Sarah," it began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I find myself thinking about you as I consider what will happen to all of this when I'm gone. You've always been different from the rest of the family, more curious, more willing to question the stories we tell ourselves. I hope that if you find this collection, you'll understand what I was trying to do and why it matters." The letter went on to explain her hopes for the materials, her fears about their potential misuse, and her belief that the stories needed to be shared with future generations. But it also contained a warning that proved prophetic. "This work will change you. Once you know these stories, you can't unknow them. You'll see the city differently, understand history differently, and feel the weight of other people's experiences. Make sure you're ready for that responsibility." As I folded the letter and placed it carefully back in the journal, I realized that Margaret's warning had come too late. I was already changed. The stories had already become part of me, and I could no longer imagine a life where I wasn't working to preserve and share them. The weight of responsibility she had described was real, but it was also a privilege, the chance to give voice to people whose experiences had been forgotten or ignored. The research team had reached a preliminary decision about how to proceed with the Willard Confession. We would publish our findings in a peer-reviewed academic journal, accompanied by a comprehensive analysis of the historical context and implications. We would also work with community organizations, particularly those representing Chinese American and other Asian American communities, to ensure that the story was shared in a way that honored the victims and promoted understanding rather than division. But first, we had more work to do. Margaret's collection contained leads to dozens of other stories that needed to be investigated and verified. There were connections to be made, patterns to be identified, and voices to be amplified. What had started as a single confession had become the foundation for a much larger project of historical recovery and truth-telling. 6 months after discovering the storage unit, I stood in the renovated community center in Portland's historic Chinatown, watching as dozens of people examined the exhibition we had created from Margaret's collection. The space buzzed with conversation as visitors discovered stories they had never heard before, saw photographs of places that no longer existed, and learned about the experiences of their ancestors and neighbors. The exhibition, titled Hidden Voices: Portland's Untold Stories, had been months in the making. After the research team published our findings about the Willard Confession, we received funding from several foundations and the City of Portland to create a public presentation of Margaret's work. The response had been overwhelming, not just from historians and academics, but from ordinary citizens who wanted to understand their city's complete history. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a carefully curated presentation of the Chinese massacre documentation, contextualized within the broader pattern of racial violence and exclusion in the American West. We had worked closely with the Chinese American community to ensure that the story was told with sensitivity and respect, focusing on the resilience and contributions of the survivors rather than just the violence they had endured. But the exhibition went far beyond that single story. Margaret's collection had provided the foundation for a comprehensive look at Portland's hidden history, from the experiences of indigenous peoples to the stories of more recent immigrant communities. Each display case told a story that had been marginalized or forgotten, accompanied by artifacts, photographs, and personal testimonies that brought the past to life. I watched as an elderly Chinese American woman studied a photograph of the original Chinatown with tears in her eyes. "My great-grandfather is in this picture," she told me. I never knew such a photograph existed. Later, an African American man spent an hour reading the testimonies from railroad workers, one of whom had been his ancestor. "My family always said he helped build the city," he said, "but I never had proof before." The exhibition had also sparked conversations about present-day Portland. Visitors were making connections between historical patterns of exclusion and contemporary issues of gentrification, displacement, and racial justice. The stories from the past were helping people understand current challenges and inspiring them to work for a more equitable future. Dr. Rodriguez approached me as I stood watching the crowds. "Margaret would be so proud," she said. "Look at what her work has accomplished." I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions: pride in what we had achieved, sadness that Margaret wasn't here to see it, and a deep sense of responsibility for the future. The the exhibition was just the beginning. We had established the Margaret Chen Center for Community History, a permanent organization dedicated to continuing her work of collecting and preserving marginalized stories. The center had already begun several new projects. We were working with local high schools to create an oral history program where students would interview elderly community members about their experiences. We had partnered with the city's refugee resettlement agencies to document the stories of recent immigrants, and we were developing relationships with tribal communities to ensure that Indigenous perspectives were included in Portland's historical narrative. But perhaps most importantly, we had inspired other people to become storytellers and historians themselves. The exhibition had generated dozens of donations from families who had their own collections of photographs, documents, and memories. People were coming forward with stories they had never shared before, trusting us to help them preserve their experiences for future generations. As the evening wound down and the last visitors left the exhibition, I found myself alone in the space that had become so meaningful to me. The displays were illuminated by soft lighting, and the photographs and documents seemed to glow with their own inner light. I could almost feel the presence of all the people whose stories were represented here, the voices that Margaret had worked so hard to preserve. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 7 months ago, I had been an unemployed woman with no clear direction, cleaning out a relative's house and feeling disconnected from my own family history. The discovery of that hidden key had set me on a path I never could have imagined, leading me to a purpose that filled my life with meaning and connection. The work hadn't been easy. There had been challenges and setbacks, moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing, and times when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Some community members had been skeptical of our motives, worried that we were exploiting painful histories for academic gain. Others had been resistant to having their assumptions about the past challenged by inconvenient truths, but there had also been moments of profound connection and understanding. I had met descendants of the families whose stories we were telling, and I had seen the healing that could come from having your experiences acknowledged and validated. I had witnessed the power of storytelling to build bridges between communities and to inspire people to work for justice in the present. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. Saw the news story about the exhibition. Your father and I are so proud of you. Aunt Margaret would be too. I smiled, thinking about how much my relationship with my family had changed since discovering Margaret's secret. We had always been close, but now there was a new depth to our connections. Learning about Margaret's work had inspired conversations about our own family history, and I had started collecting stories from my parents and grandparents about their experiences as immigrants and first-generation Americans. The Chinese American community had embraced the project in ways I never expected. The exhibition had sparked a renewed interest in family histories and cultural preservation. Several families had started their own oral history projects, and there was talk of establishing a permanent museum dedicated to Chinese American experiences in the Pacific Northwest. But the impact extended far beyond any single community. The exhibition had attracted visitors from around the country and even internationally. Scholars were citing Margaret's work in their research, and several universities had expressed interest in establishing partnerships with the center. The model we had created was being replicated in other cities, inspiring similar projects to uncover and preserve hidden histories. As I prepared to leave the exhibition space, I stopped at Margaret's photograph, which we had placed at the entrance with a plaque describing her life and work. In the photo, she was standing in front of her house, surrounded by some of the books and artifacts that had filled her home. She looked determined and slightly mysterious, as if she knew secrets that others didn't. "Thank you," I whispered to the photograph. "Thank you for trusting me with this." I gathered my things and headed for the exit, but as I reached the door, I turned back for one last look at the exhibition. The space felt alive with stories, connections, and possibilities. Margaret's collection had become something much larger than she probably ever imagined, a catalyst for community healing, historical understanding, and social justice. As I walked through Portland's streets toward my car, I noticed things I had never seen before. The city was layered with history, and every building, every street corner, every public space held stories waiting to be discovered. Margaret had taught me to see these layers, to understand that the past was never really past, and that the voices of previous generations were always speaking to us if we knew how to listen. The downtown area looked different at night, with the soft glow of streetlights illuminating buildings that had witnessed over a century of change. I passed the site where the original Chinatown had stood, now occupied by modern office buildings and parking lots. But thanks to Margaret's work, the stories of the people who had lived and worked there were no longer lost to time. My phone rang, and I saw that it was David Kim, our center's director of community outreach. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said excitedly. "I just got a call from a woman in Seattle who says her grandmother has a collection of documents about the Chinese communities in Washington state. She saw our exhibition online and wants to know if we'd be interested in examining them." I smiled, feeling a familiar surge of excitement. "Send me her contact information," I said. "We'll drive up there next week." As I ended the call, I realized that this was exactly what Margaret would have wanted. The work was expanding, connecting communities across the Pacific Northwest, and inspiring others to become guardians of their own stories. The hidden envelope had been just the beginning, a key that opened not just one storage unit, but an entire world of possibilities for historical preservation and community connection. The Seattle contact was just one of many leads that had emerged since the exhibition opened. We had received calls from families in Vancouver, British Columbia, who wanted to share stories about Chinese-Canadian experiences. A group in San Francisco had reached out about collaborating on a West Coast network of community history projects. Even international connections were developing, with researchers in China expressing interest in the diaspora stories we were preserving. I got in my car and started the engine. But before pulling away, I took one last look at the community center. Through the windows, I could see the exhibition displays glowing in the darkness, the photographs and documents bearing witness to lives lived, struggles overcome, and communities built against all odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were grant applications to write for expanding our programs, interviews to conduct with community elders whose stories needed to be preserved, and new partnerships to develop with organizations across the region. The Margaret Chen Center had a full calendar of events planned for the coming months, including workshops for community members interested in preserving their own family histories. One of our most ambitious upcoming projects involved working with local artists to create a public mural that would incorporate elements from Margaret's collection. The mural would be painted on the side of a building in the historic Chinatown area, creating a permanent reminder of the stories that had been hidden for so long. We were also planning a traveling version of the exhibition that could visit schools, libraries, and community centers throughout Oregon and Washington. The goal was to bring these stories to people who might not be able to visit Portland, particularly in rural communities where access to cultural institutions was limited. The center had also begun digitizing Margaret's entire collection, creating an online archive that would make the materials accessible to researchers and community members around the world. This work was painstaking and expensive, but essential for ensuring that the stories would be preserved for future generations. As I drove through the quiet streets of Portland, I thought about all the other storage units, attics, and basements throughout the city that might contain similar treasures. How many other Margaret Chens were out there, quietly preserving stories that the rest of us had forgotten? How many families had boxes of photographs and documents that could add new chapters to our understanding of the past? The success of our exhibition had inspired other cities to examine their own hidden histories. A group in Sacramento was organizing a project focused on the experiences of Chinese immigrants during the gold rush. Historians in Vancouver were working with Indigenous communities to document stories that had been suppressed during the residential school era. The model Margaret had created was spreading, adapted to different communities and different historical experiences. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from a student who had visited the exhibition earlier in the week. "Thank you for sharing these stories. They've inspired me to start interviewing my own grandparents about their experiences as refugees from Vietnam. I never realized how much history was sitting right at my kitchen table." Messages like this had been arriving regularly since the exhibition opened. Young people were connecting with their elders in new ways, asking questions about family histories they had never thought to explore. Teachers were incorporating the stories into their lesson plans, helping students understand how historical events had affected real people in their own community. The ripple effects were exactly what Margaret had hoped for when she began her work over 40 years ago. She had believed that understanding the past was essential for building a better future, and she had dedicated her life to ensuring that all voices, not just the powerful and privileged, would be remembered. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see the lights of the city stretching out below me, each one representing a life, a story, a potential discovery waiting to happen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new stories to preserve. But tonight, I was content, knowing that I had honored Margaret's trust and helped ensure that the voices she had worked so hard to preserve would continue to speak to future generations. The Margaret Chen Center had already received its first major research grant, which would allow us to expand our work and hire additional staff. We were planning to establish a fellowship program that would bring scholars and community historians to Portland to work with our collections and develop new projects. But perhaps most importantly, we had created a model for how historical preservation could be a tool for community building and social justice. The center wasn't just about the past. It was about helping people understand how historical patterns continued to shape contemporary experiences and inspiring them to work for positive change. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, looking up at the stars that were barely visible through Portland's urban glow. Margaret had spent her life looking beneath the surface of things, finding the hidden stories that others had overlooked. Now that work would continue, carried forward by all of us who had learned to see the layers of history that surround us every day. The old envelope had been empty until I lifted the false bottom, but what I found there was worth more than any treasure. The understanding that we are all connected by the stories we share, and that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, but the responsibility to keep the memories of others alive. In the distance, I could hear the sound of a train whistle, carrying its own cargo of stories through the Portland night. And somewhere in the city, I knew there were other envelopes waiting to be opened, other false bottoms waiting to be discovered, other voices waiting for someone to listen and to share their experiences with the world. Margaret's work would continue, carried forward by all of us who had learned that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding who we are and who we can become. The key she had hidden so carefully had unlocked not just a storage unit, but a new way of understanding our place in the continuing story of human experience. And that, I realized as I finally headed inside, was the greatest gift of all. The empty envelope had contained the most valuable thing possible: the tools to uncover truth, preserve memory, and build connections between past, present, and future. Margaret's legacy would live on in every story preserved, every connection made, and every young person inspired to become a guardian of their own family's history. The hidden key had opened more than a storage unit. It had opened the door to a lifetime of meaningful work, community connection, and the deep satisfaction that comes from ensuring that no story is ever truly lost.